Today we explore the world's second most popular role-playing game.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Hey guys, welcome to the show. My name is Matt and I am your host. If you are looking for show notes to these podcast episodes, or you want tabletop RPG resources, you can head over to dicegeeks.com where you will find all of that. But first, you're going to want to stick around for today's interview. My guest and I discuss Pathfinder, which is the world's second most popular RPG, behind Dungeons & Dragons, of course. We discuss Pathfinder's genesis, its future, as well as other topics. My guest today is game designer and director of content at No Direction, a Pathfinder news, podcast, and blog network, Ryan Costello. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matt. How you doing?
I am doing well. How are you today?
I'm doing just fine.
Awesome. With the popularity of Dungeons & Dragons just exploding, and of course it is the most popular role-playing game in the world, I think some people might not realize that the second most popular role-playing game is Pathfinder. Could you just tell us a little bit what Pathfinder is and where did it come from?
Sure. Now, generally when people ask me that question, I'll ask them, how nerdy do you want this answer to be?
Oh, pretty nerdy, man.
All right. So Dungeons & Dragons, the world's most popular role-playing game, the first role-playing game. It's been around for years, or decades, and went through multiple editions, including 3.5, which revolutionized a lot of things and really made a systematic system. So gone were things like THAC0 and a lot of more arbitrary rules. And finally, a game was put together that was like, let's take the rules seriously instead of just treating it as something that'll facilitate the storytelling. You can still do the storytelling part, but if you also want the crunch, we bring the crunch. And it was super popular. It revived the brand because second edition had died. TSR, the company that published it, had died and was purchased by Wizards of the Coast. And so this was the first time that Dungeons & Dragons kind of had a renaissance. And it lasted for about 7 years, I think, was the publishing life. It went from 3.0 to 3.5. And one of the elements that made it super successful was the open gaming license, which let non-Wizards of the Coast publishers publish new material for a Dungeons & Dragons game. You couldn't use the Dungeons & Dragons branding. Usually had to call it the world's most popular role-playing game. But you could put out a book and just say, like, this is compatible with the world's most popular role-playing game. And that way, instead of a whole bunch of new systems coming up because there's a new Dungeons & Dragons Renaissance and new competition, it's everyone was kind of a type of partner, and there was no buy-in for the open game license. You showed up. If you felt like publishing, you followed those rules, and you were allowed to publish PDFs, printed books, anything that adds to the Dungeons & Dragons 3.0 and 3.5 game. One of the things that one of the reasons that a lot of people bought into it is because the open gaming license was legal for forever. There was no way that Wizards of the Coast could say, okay, and now we are done with this. I'm sorry if you'd spent $10,000 on art and we're this close to publishing a book. Nope. You will never have to worry about that happening. It was going to be available forever. Which, when 4th edition came out and it was not the hotness that 3rd edition was, really kind of bit Wizards in the butt. So Paizo, a company that was publishing third-party publishers and actually had the license to release Dungeon Magazine and Dragon Magazine, they were waiting for the 4th edition version of the OGL so that they knew how they could continue to support themselves, how they could continue to make products and make money. And it was a company that already had dozens of employees. So when Wizards of the Coast was really dragging their heels about how they would be supporting third-party publishers, someone at Paizo, Jason Bullman, put together a document called Operation Mon Mothma. And this is a new version of Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 that we will release using OGL, so it'll be perfectly legal. But instead of telling people they need to own the old 3.5 Player's Handbook, We'll put out our own core rulebook. We'll call it Pathfinder, which is a really cool name. We'll put out adventures for it. We will support it as though it's a brand new game, but it will also be reverse compatible. So if you're one of those gamers that's got hundreds of dollars and several shelves full of full of 3.5 Dungeons and Dragons material, good news. It's still perfectly valid and it continues to be supported as a game. And so then several things happened. 4th edition was not as popular mechanically as Wizards of the Coast had hoped. Mm-hmm. And they also made the decision to reset the timelines to reboot all of their popular campaigns. So some of the people that would have been satisfied with a different mechanical game but were really invested in the stories were also not satisfied with Dungeons & Dragons and Wizards of the Coast. And all of a sudden, there was a third thing that also gets super complicated, but during the announcement of 4th edition, the main thing Wizards of the Coast was focusing on was these digital tools that would be available.
Yes.
And tragedy struck. One of the developers was murdered, and that never got off the ground. And so for reasons that were completely outside of Wizards of the Coast control, there were 3 pillars of just catastrophe upon 4th edition's launch. And suddenly people were saying they've tried 4th edition. They're not satisfied for one of 3 reasons or multiple reasons. But here's this Pathfinder thing that is gorgeous because Paizo made the really good decision to emphasize art and graphic design for their books. Mm-hmm. It's still a familiar system, so it's easy enough to pick up. If you're already invested in the game, it feels like you're actually adding to your collection instead of replacing it. And very quickly, as 4th edition was constantly trying to catch up with itself and just fix its mistakes, Pathfinder actually managed to outsell Dungeons & Dragons, which was one of the only times that a non-Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game was the top-selling role-playing game in the world.
Wow. So one of the developers was murdered? I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, it was a murder-suicide where, she was killed by her husband or boyfriend. And
gosh.
He killed himself. And so apparently she was the only person that really had the creative keys to this project. And so there was no recovering from that loss.
Oh my goodness. Well, that's horrifying, obviously. Okay, well, thank you for that kind of capsule history there of Pathfinder. Now, Pathfinder just released the 2nd edition. Isn't that correct?
Yes, they did. They released it at Gen Con, so just a couple of months ago.
Okay. So what does that do to the system then?
It completely abandons the 3.5 engine.
Oh, wow.
And it tries to fix some things that were problems with it. Well, 3.5 was great, but 2 of its fatal flaws were first level was really bad. It was slow, and it was only one of the only times in the game where you could be making the right choices, but not have the mechanics to back it up because your character is too low level to have all the options you want to just fulfill your concept, unless it's a very basic concept. Mm-hmm. And also it's way more dependent on the dice, on the rolls of the dice, because your boosts are so low. And because if you look at the back of the bestiary, there's these are the stats that monsters of certain levels should have. And monsters of first level should have 13 AC. But for whatever reason, the average AC was 17, which means that people were going into it and the game was breaking its own rule and it was punishing the players at low level for it for no reason. There was really only a couple of monsters that were actually properly statted out for low level. So part of the problem was Paizo and Wizards of the Coast fault before it. But anyway, it all resulted in first level is a drag, and most people will start the game at first level. And so it's a bad first impression. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that 20th level, and actually anything above 16th level, was kind of broken because you would add just actions you can do, or a lot of times you take options that make you better at doing things more efficiently. And so fighters would have 1 million attacks, and wizards would be able to cast haste and cast they'd be able to cast a spell for free if they had the right equipment, and then they'd cast the regular spell. And so any given turn took forever. And the consequences of every turn were so massive that you couldn't plan ahead for what your turn was going to be when it was finally your turn, 3 players down, because the battlefield would be completely changed as a result of the last 2 or 3 people's turns. So one of the reasons one of the goals of 2nd edition was to just fix the system, make sure it's playable from first level to 20th level. Because they're even the ones that are releasing the most adventures for Pathfinder, and their adventure paths, which are these 6 volume adventures that were one of the main products that Paizo put out. Mm-hmm. They would usually top out around 15th or 16th level. And so they're selling this rule book that says you can play for 20th levels, But even we, the people who produce that rulebook, can't figure out how to make it fun and worthwhile after about 16th level. So second edition, one of the main changes is to the action economy. So on your turn, you have 3 actions to choose from. It's no longer standard action and move action, which is how it worked in in third edition and in Pathfinder first edition. Mm-hmm. You've got 3 actions, and so you can do some combination of moving, some combination of hitting, some combination of spell casting, and other small minor things. And this revolutionized the game. This is absolutely, without a doubt, the best thing about Pathfinder second edition, to the point that on my podcast, when we were interviewing Paizo's designers, we were telling them what's the best thing about second edition besides the action economy, because that is so obviously the right answer. And actually, the guy who came up with the action economy, Stephen Radley McFarlane, kind of took exception to it. He was like, oh no, am I talking about it too much? And so we actually let him gush and brag about how he made the system that really revolutionized the game. But one of the reasons that it's still a viable playable game at 20th level is that there are, up till now, because we've only got a couple of rulebooks out, but there are very few or no options that let you get a 4th action out of your turn. So you'll be better at things and you'll have more things you can do, but you'll never have more ability to do more things, which really speeds up high level play. And they also boosted up low level stuff so that you're a little bit hardier. You get a few more options right out of the gate. And so it fixed either end of the spectrum, which is really important.
Okay. Now, I guess just say if somebody is very familiar with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, how does Pathfinder 2nd edition or even Pathfinder 1st edition differ from D&D 5th edition?
All right. Well, they are both very different games in that the systems are completely different. But if you approach them with the same philosophy of, I want to be a character in a story, I want to tell stories in a medieval fantasy setting, they're very similar. And so you can have the same jumping on point. And so that's where you start. It's basically picture a character you would make in 5th edition. You've played 5th edition, Matt?
Oh, yes, all the time.
All right. So what is a character you like to play in 5th edition?
Well, I usually run games, but I love to play a gnome wizard if I get a chance.
Excellent. Okay. Well, there's gnomes and there's wizards in Pathfinder, both 1st edition and 2nd edition. So what is it about gnomes that you like?
I think it's just because they're smart. They tinker with little objects. They seem to be connected to the world a little bit more, that they seem to be part of the fantasy world just a little bit better than some of the other ones. Yeah.
Okay. Well, then let me tell you how gnomes fit into the campaign setting for Pathfinder. They were part of the first world, which is where Fae come from. So imagine if there was an alpha test for the world. Mm-hmm. And once they worked it out, it's like, okay, now we're going to make the actual world. And in some extraplanar place, this original copy of the world still exists and kind of leaks out into the main world. Mm-hmm. And that's gnomes. Gnomes were one of the main creatures on the first world. So they are really connected to nature and to just how the world works.
Awesome.
But one of the things about gnomes is that unlike other races, they suffer from something called the bleaching, which means if they ever get bored or ennui or just feel like they've seen everything, they start to lose their color and pigmentation until they turn just chalk white and just essentially die of boredom. So gnomes in Pathfinder constantly have to be discovering new things, going on new adventures, just tinkering in new areas of play so that they stave off the bleaching and that they remain like vibrantly colored and just vibrant with life. So how are we so far? You
awesome.
Interested in? Yeah. I am so glad you picked gnomes because gnomes are also my favorite race. And Pathfinder did a really great job of making gnomes stand out because gnomes are often seen as just like not halflings.
Yeah.
And Paizo and Pathfinder does a very good job of making gnomes their own thing. Mm-hmm. So in first edition, if you want to play a gnome, you've got some like connection with animals. You can speak with animals. You've got a couple of other spells that start off right out of the gate. You are able to communicate with nature, similar to things that you said that you enjoyed. Mm-hmm. In second edition, you make a couple more choices right out the boat. So you are a gnome, but then you have to choose like, well, what heritage of gnome are you? And so if you want to emphasize more your tinkering, those options aren't out yet, unfortunately. But if you want to do like dabbling, that kind of that version of it. I forget the name because second edition is still new to all of us, but that's one version of gnome you can play. And then someone else who likes a different aspect of the gnome lore or the gnome concept can come to the same table as you, also playing a gnome, possibly even playing a gnome wizard, but they could have chose a lot of options that make their gnome feel very different while still retaining something that you and he have in common as gnomes.
Oh, that sounds great.
And so it's similar for basically all the options. For wizard, you would choose your, in first edition, you would choose your school. In second edition, they did something really clever with the wizard, which is your arcane thesis, which first you choose your field of study, like what type of magic do you like? What direction do you want your spellcasting to go? And then it encourages you to actually come up with a title for your thesis as though you had gone to wizard college and had to present and defend this. Yeah. And so there's a couple of examples in the core rulebook, and a lot of the second edition message boards are just people bragging about how clever they were with their arcane thesis.
No, that sounds awesome. I mean, that would, that would just, it seems like that would just add a lot of flavor to the wizard class.
And that is something that second edition does very well. It took a bit of a step back because first edition is a very hands-on system in that basically if it's got flavor to it, then it's got mechanics that tie into it. Whereas second editions, it's like, here's some areas that you've got a little more flexibility. So like the gnomes, there's a version of the gnome that they call the deep gnome. And that is a gnome with dark vision. And it gives the example that you could be the Svirfneblin, which is like the Darklands is the Pathfinder version of the Underdark. Okay. So it's the Darklands version of the gnome. But you don't have to be a Svirfneblin to get this advantage, to get these mechanics. That's just an example of the types of gnomes that have this mechanic. So you can say like, oh, I like the gnome. I like the idea of getting dark vision. Not a fan of being a Svirfneblin. So I'm just going to say I'm, maybe some smaller sects of gnome or some gnome that's maybe like 3 or 4 generations removed from the Svirfneblin, but still has some of the physical attributes of it. It is a lot more allowance in how you apply your mechanics in a lot of ways.
Okay. Yeah. I guess I should say I've run 2 sessions of Pathfinder First Edition, mainly as just a combat sim, but I'm not familiar with the world really at all of Pathfinder. So that was really interesting. And then second edition, I haven't even got to look at that yet, which I think it would be fun to check that out and read the book at least. But I am running mostly D&D 5e these days.
So it does work as a combat sim, and there's even a PvP version of Pathfinder called Conflict that was put out by a third party, because Pathfinder has an open game license very similar to the one that Wizards of the Coast put out for Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, because Paizo acknowledged that it's like, this is what made us exist, and so we are going to continue that tradition and make sure other people can support us. And it also became like a proving ground for Pathfinder designers, in that you can't just pull someone from a vacuum and say, now be a Pathfinder designer, but third-party publishers and the other people like blogs and whatever that you are allowed to do with the open gaming license lets people practice their craft, get their ideas out there. If you're selling a product, odds are you're going to get feedback on it, and eventually you become a better designer, and then you increase your chances of being hired by Paizo to put out some actual first-party stuff.
Oh, that's great. Now, you have mentioned it a couple of times, and I also publish some things under the open game license. Could you just maybe just a little bit more background on the OGL, so just in case we're leaving somebody behind?
A little background on the OGL, sure. So I believe it was developed by Ryan Dancy originally. What are we looking for as far as background on the OGL?
Well, just if somebody has been intrigued that they can publish for D&D or Pathfinder with the OGL, what does that mean, just a little bit?
Okay, so the first thing it means is that you've got about a page of legal text that has to go towards the back of your book. Start by reading that. It will tell you that you can use the mechanics, except for a rare few mechanics. So product identity is the thing you have to avoid. Basically, if it's something that is more of an intellectual property. So like in Pathfinder, there is a creature called the Sandpoint Devil. And the Sandpoint Devil is named after Sandpoint, one of their major cities. So you couldn't create 10 variants of the Sandpoint Devil because it's named after part of their intellectual property.
Yeah.
So I'm the furthest thing from a lawyer. So like, this is not legal advice, but
Yes.
read it over. If it's a gray area, there's plenty of places on the Paizo boards where you can ask other non-lawyers to give you their interpretation, or you can hire a lawyer to get the real definition. But actually, Paizo is actually very happy to answer questions on their own message boards. Mm-hmm. So generally, if you just want to add something that's really setting neutral, so just I like fighters, but I feel like fighters should be better at a single weapon. So if you want to make like Hawkeye, where you're not just a good archer, but you can beat people up with your bow, and you don't feel there's enough mechanics for that, you can release a whole PDF of how to beat people up with ranged weapons. And that's fine, because as long as it doesn't mention specific areas, locations, characters that Paizo owns or Wizards of the Coast before them, you're totally okay.
Yeah. And no, thank you for doing that. Just so if there's any listeners out there, so they'll understand what the open game license is a little bit. And like I said, I published some things under that. And like your Sandpoint example, of course, in D&D, it would be like a beholder. A beholder is a creature for D&D, created by D&D, so you can't really mess with that. But you can do other things as well. Now, Paizo also has a game called Starfinder. Could you tell us a little about that?
Sure. Starfinder was originally pitched as basically the Pathfinder rules, but a sci-fi setting. Mm-hmm. But by the time it came out, they'd actually tweaked the rules enough that it wasn't just a Pathfinder clone. They'd actually made quite a lot of changes to the math and how gameplay works, that it feels like a different game. But if you're familiar with Pathfinder, you can usually, like, that's an easy first step into getting into the game. Mm-hmm. But it's completely the same setting, except that there is something called the Gap, which I believe it's, hold on, is it called the Gap? I'm going to say it's called the Gap, but I might be wrong. Basically, there's like a 300-year period where the universe got amnesia, and even the gods won't say what happened, whether it's because they don't know or because it's just some secret, or possibly they did something to the universe and now they don't want anyone to know about it. Mm-hmm. But in that time, the world of Galarian, which is the main setting for Pathfinder, disappeared. And in its place, there's a giant space station called Absalom Station, which is named after one of the major cities in Pathfinder. Okay. So what's cool about that is that if you are doing adventures on in Pathfinder set on Galarian, mm-hmm. you don't have to feel like, well, this is meaningless because Starfinder exists, so at some point my stories will be long forgotten. Mm-hmm. Because they are like specifically mystically forgotten, mm-hmm. you feel like everything you are doing actually has a little more weight. But then the advantage is that the gods are the same, the magic works more or less the same, like the lore is the same, it's just been pushed forward thousands of years. Mm-hmm. And so there's a familiarity there, and you can see where some things have changed. Like, whereas in Pathfinder, there's a league of adventurers called the Pathfinder Society. In mm-hmm. Starfinder, they've become the Starfinder Society. But it's not just a flat, like, sci-fi reflection of the Pathfinder Society, because Starfinder Society accidentally lost like 3/4 of their members on their first mission. And so when the Starfinder role-playing game starts, the Starfinder Society has barely any members. And it's actually something you can join right as it's been born, even though it's technically an organization with thousands of years of history.
I've just seen kind of some of the artwork and that, and read just a little bit about Starfinder, but it sounds very interesting. Do you have any advice maybe for somebody who's played Dungeons and Dragons? Why would they want to check out Pathfinder?
We're actually going to do a whole series of videos where we introduce Pathfinder 2nd edition to a 1st edition player, a 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons player, a non-role player, and a Starfinder player, with the goal being that we're going to answer that question of why you would want to do Pathfinder as an alternative to something that's basically Pathfinder exists as the alternative to the main, mm-hmm. the big dog in the yard. Uh-huh. There's a couple of reasons. One is that Pathfinder is extremely well supported as a community, so you will find a lot of community tools and whatnot. And Paizo has a history of being very allowant with its rules, and so there are apps and whatnot that you can make for Pathfinder that make the game easier, that really have changed how Pathfinder players play a similar game, that Wizards of the Coast has always been gun shy about, because they have a few more legal filters that they have to go through, being such a large company and having such a larger economic footprint in the world. So you will find that if you play Pathfinder, it has better support, and you can do things. You can do more at the table because there are more things supporting you. Likewise, they have their Pathfinder Society organized play program where it's similar to, what is it, the Adventurers League? Is that the 5th edition organized play program?
Mm-hmm.
So the Adventurers League is actually taking a lot of cues from Pathfinder Society, because before 5th edition came out, Wizards of the Coast had decided that printed adventures don't sell. Mm-hmm. And so that was another thing that Paizo did when they first released Pathfinder 1st edition. They were like, and we're going to emphasize adventures. And it reminded people that there was a right way to sell adventures. And Pathfinder Society is one of the ways they do it. It's $3 or $4 PDF will get you a 5 or 6 hour session that you then log your results onto the Paizo website. And you can level up your character that way. And that way I could be playing in my local community, playing my Pathfinder Society character. And then it's like, oh, it's time for PaizoCon. I'm going to fly, across the border and across the continent, go to Seattle. Mm-hmm. And now suddenly I can continue to play this same character because I've got all of this digital paperwork that kind of shows the path that he's been on and the adventures that he's been on. And I could just sit at a table there and continue his adventures. Yeah. So that's a very cool element. Otherwise, the main reason that you would play Pathfinder over 5th edition is the mechanics. It's both 1st edition and 2nd edition are more mechanically complex systems. Mm-hmm. And that may sound like a hit against them, but that allows you more customizability, more control over the build of your character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a kind of a big point that I hear a lot of times, that, Pathfinder has more rules or it's more complicated. How would you answer somebody who just says, oh, well, Pathfinder just seems too complicated?
Then maybe 5th edition is the right game for them. Like I have no problem with 5th edition. In fact, one of the biggest hurdles to becoming a Pathfinder player was no longer thinking of myself as a Dungeons and Dragons player.
Okay.
And the option is still there, and I did play a little bit of 4th edition when it was the currently published game. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I moved over to Pathfinder because that was the type of game I wanted. I felt like I was more invested in what was going on because these rules were allowing me to do more things. Whereas, from what I understand about 5th edition, because I actually have not played it yet and have only really glanced at the rules, I understand that to be a little bit more of a narrative game. Yeah. And I would rather there be crunch backing it up. So my best example is from Captain America: Civil War. There's the famous airport scene, right, where the two groups of superheroes are just kind of running after each other. Mm-hmm. So in one group, you've got Captain America and Bucky and Hawkeye. And I'm bringing up Hawkeye a lot this episode. So their goal is to get to the plane as quick as possible. But in the shot, these two characters that we just saw in the previous scene outrunning a motorcycle, they are running as fast as Hawkeye, who has just chump human legs. Mm-hmm. That bugs me because the mechanics don't work. They established rules and they are breaking their own rules. And so, yes, it's a prettier shot having the two groups of superheroes running at the same pace, but it doesn't make sense because the rule system says it doesn't make sense. I would prefer playing a narrative that also is supported by rules. And so when you're doing something, you know that it actually it works that way because the system tells you it works that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. No, that's good. Now, let's just say that somebody is going to run a game. I don't know. Do you run games a lot or do you play more?
I'm split 50-50.
Oh, okay. Okay. So what is just some of your basic advice for somebody who's running a game, maybe their first Pathfinder game? What would you tell that person?
We're talking 1st edition or 2nd edition?
Either one.
Yeah, all right. Either one. So the first thing you need to do is make sure you understand the action economy and basically what makes an action. So in 1st edition, what differentiates a standard action from a move action? Because it's basically every turn is 6 seconds, and you can think of the standard action as something that takes 3.5 seconds, and the move action is something that takes 2.5 seconds. So there's a little bit more weight and significance to what you're doing with the standard action, but you couldn't do 2 in a turn, but you could do 2 move actions in a turn. So if you can get your head around why standard actions are standard actions and why move actions are move actions, then just as you're developing your story or you're reading through the story, if you're doing a public adventure, keep that in mind. Just keep coming up with okay, so the things they're talking about here are standard actions, these are move actions, and you can start to see how it'll play out when it gets to combat, which is really where the mechanics start to, overtake the game. Because when it's just exploration and whatnot, it's usually a single roll will tell you what the result is and how things are progressing. And you could stop for 5 minutes to look up a single rule. Whereas when you get to combat, to understand combat, you need to understand combat, the whole thing. So understand combat, understand the action economy. And so the same thing applies for second edition, but you don't have to be as granular about what's a standard action versus a move action. You just have to figure out like, okay, this is an action. You get 3 of those in a turn. I'm picturing what I can do on my turn. And if the rules aren't quite clear about what something is, or you don't quite think you understand it, but you have to make a decision on a fly instead of stopping your entire the entire combat and the entire session, you basically just have to decide, is this a single action, or is this something that's so complex like casting a spell that it might take up a couple of actions?
Okay. Now, when you're running a game, I've been thinking a lot about preparation for a session because, as life kind of goes on and you have a family and jobs and things like this, do you spend a lot of time prepping for a session?
No, in fact, I will call up something that I just ran for an actual play that we ran, and I have not, we haven't released it yet, but just give me a second here. If I remembered the name of it, I'd be able to find it much more quickly. Oh yeah, it's Mimips 11. So we have an actual play podcast on the No Direction Network called Adventurous, and we are running through the War for the Crown Adventure Path, which is a Pathfinder First Edition adventure path, and we're out of content, and we weren't able to get the entire cast together to run the next session. So I said, all right, we met this one NPC, Mimips, who was a kobold shopkeeper who was clearly kind of crooked, but also endearing about it, and we all kind of really latched onto Mimips. So I'm going to run a side quest about Mimips' side hustle, and we're going to call it Mimips 11, and you're all kind of his, like the Ocean's 11 crew. You are Mimips' crew, and you are running some kind of a heist. So my notes for this session that ended up going about 5 hours is part 1, Mimips Mansion, loose ranking of Mimips 11. I talk about markers, fetchers, operatives, 3 question marks. I don't define these terms. These are just terms I remembered that I wanted to use. Then I've got a puzzle, so I've actually got 4 rooms worth of icons. Then part 2, the Ram Circle. Grand Prince Stavian III is dead. That's my only note there. It's part 3, gather information. Part 4, the 3-piece suit club owned by the Bay triplets. That is the extent of my notes.
Okay.
I have a much stronger creative brain than I have information recall brain, which is why even though Pathfinder is known for its printed adventures, I do most of my stuff improvised, and I can't prep because the more I prep, the less I'm relying on my creative brain, and the more I'm relying on information recall brain, and so the more likely that we'll get to the point where I'm supposed to remember something and I completely skip over it. So for this adventure, I did make one NPC. A monk who's really good at grappling, weighing you down, and pounding on you. And I forgot to use, forget the name of it, but basically the way he was mechanically supposed to work is that with his first action, he's supposed to take a stance that weighs him down and makes his attacks more. Oh, mountain stance. That's it. It gives his attacks more oomph. I forgot to do that because it was one of the very few things that I actually had written out as like, I have planned this, and I totally forgot it just because I cannot work that way. I need to be relying on my creative brain a lot more. Actually, during that session, at one point, they were talking about infiltrating a casino, and they talked about maybe we'll try an audition for a stage show just to get in there, and so that it's not weird when we're kind of getting the lay of the land. Plus, they were an all-monster party, so that was one of the only excuses they could see for having the whole party in there. And one of the players, Lauren, kept being like, come on, guys, we need to consider what Ryan has planned. He clearly doesn't want to improvise some kind of circus act that we're going to be doing. And while she was saying that, I was just thinking like, okay, so when they do their circus act, this is what they're going to do. And I had nothing contradicting this plan of action that they were talking about. And I kind of regret that she said that because it was a completely meta reason that was supposed to be doing me a favor, but did nobody any favors at all.
No, that's interesting because, I've even though right now I had decided to run Curse of Strahd for my weekly group, I have been going more and more no prep over the last few years. And actually, I just put out a book called The No Prep Gamemaster because I just don't. I just don't understand, kind of why a game master should be expected to put 20 hours of prep time into a 3-hour session with their friends. I mean, it's just impossible if you have, if you have a family, a life, anything like that. It just seems impossible.
So I'm impressed that you're able to write a book about that, because anytime that my co-host Param on No Direction has suggested, well, what if we do an episode on improvising so that people know what to do? And I'm like, you are approaching it like somebody who plans out a session. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just improvising. I cannot quantify that into useful advice, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I've gotten that critique as well, because people will say, oh, well, you say to do these things. Well, that's prep. But I consider prep to be like, reading a specific, adventure, or reading a specific campaign, having monsters, writing out scenes, creating an entire map with all the rooms numbered and stuff like that. So I just give some strategies to where people can kind of avoid some of that stuff. And my whole thing is that if you're just talking to some people, maybe you're having dinner or something with some old friends, and they say, oh, you still play Dungeons and Dragons? And if you say yes, you can just run a session right then without having to worry about coming up with, a huge campaign, because you can just use some of these strategies just to kind of jump right into it.
Yeah. At PaizoCon, one of my dreams is to just say, like, to wear a pin, say, let's roll for initiative, and just to have an adventure that I play out through PaizoCon, but with different players every time. And it was just like, if somebody actually asked me to roll for initiative, it's like, all right, you got 5 minutes of my time. I continue the story, given the very little information about what happened with the previous players, and just kind of go from there. And by the end of PaizoCon, I would be the only one who knew the whole story, but I would have had hundreds of players involved in it.
That sounds cool.
It also sounds like it would take up my entire vacation, which is why I've never actually executed
it. Yeah. Now, you've mentioned your podcast and that a couple times now. Can you just tell us more about that? It's called No Direction?
Yeah, No Direction, like the Druid spell. Okay. It's the Pathfinder News, Reviews, and Interviews podcast. It started out as 3.5 Private Sanctuary, which started in 2007 when podcasts were barely a thing.
Wow.
Are you interested in the whole history of No Direction?
Well, I mean, we have a little bit of time.
All right. So again, this is 2007. So podcasts were not a common phrase. People still had iPods, which is obviously where podcast comes from. Uh-huh. And I had just gotten into Slice of Sci-Fi, which was a sci-fi podcast by Evo Terra and Michael R. Meningay. Evo Terra being just one of the fathers of podcasting, and Michael R. Meningay being a sci-fi author. Mm-hmm. And I was listening to it, and I was like, this is great, and I'd love to do something like this. So I'm going to do the Dungeons & Dragons version of my friend Justin's G.I. Joe website, General's Joe's, where he just was reviewing older material, and just it was a cool content website. I wanted to do the Dungeons & Dragons version of that. So I bought Podcasting for Dummies, which had come out and was co-authored by Evo Terra. Mm-hmm. And so based on that, I bought a mixer. I started getting the physical equipment that I needed and started learning about the tech side of it. And around that time, when I was planning on being like a rah-rah Dungeons & Dragons podcast, Wizards of the Coast announced that they were ending 3rd edition, and that everything they were saying about 4th edition just did not interest me. Mm-hmm. So I was like, all right, well, we're turning things around. I am ready to launch a podcast, but I have lost my concept. So instead of being the rah-rah Dungeons & Dragons podcast, I'm going to be the, hey, remember 3rd edition? We think it's still pretty great, and just be like a small podcast with a website with a forum on it for people that, the few people that weren't going to move on to 4th edition, and they were going to stick to 3rd edition, while 4th edition went on to become, the major player in the role-playing game hobby and industry that it was obviously destined to be. Mm-hmm. And that's when things got interesting, because in real time, we were finding out like 4th edition is failing people's expectations in a lot of ways. Here's this company, Paizo, that is also sticking to 3rd edition. So like before Pathfinder was a rule book, we had interviews with Jason Bullman, the lead designer, and many members of Pathfinder, of the Pathfinder design team and the developing team. Mm-hmm. And so for as long as there has been a Pathfinder, there has been No Direction, the Pathfinder podcast. And for years, we were one of the only Pathfinder podcasts. And it wasn't until maybe the last couple of years that other podcasts have started to come up. And every now and then I'll contact them and be like, hey, if you ever want to collaborate, and they all know me. And they know our podcast because we have been around so long that we are practically synonymous with Pathfinder, at least on the podcast side of things. And my co-host and I we've won like a Volunteer of the Year award from Paizo for our work because we go to the conventions, we go to PaizoCon and Gen Con. We record the seminars, we release them because our motto is "We con when you can't." And we've kind of institutionalized ourselves as a part of the Pathfinder community, which, as I said, was something that Paizo has always been supportive of. So as our podcast went on, it went from occasionally we would have a Paizo staffer to we could regularly assume that if we wanted a Paizo staffer, we could have them on. And now, honestly, we have been rejected very few times when we've requested a certain staffer to talk about a topic. And it's usually more of a scheduling thing because Paizo is just super happy to have us on to like hype their products and to talk enthusiastically with their designers. And even when we don't like things, which is part of why I think part of why we aren't just seen as like a Pathfinder shill, because if we don't like something, we will be very open about it. They trust us to be respectful with their staff when we're talking about the things that they designed that we may not have liked. So now it is a podcast that releases twice monthly. We record over Twitch every other Wednesday. And then on the alternate Wednesdays, we've got a Starfinder podcast called No Direction Beyond. And we do monthly get-togethers called Geek Together, where we either get together, play a video game, just talk dirty stuff. At one point, we had like a session where a bunch of my staff, because we've got like 10 bloggers on our site as well. Oh. A bunch of us were just hanging out and painting. And so some of it was we had our cameras on our miniatures, or I was painting an action figure, and we were just talking about our techniques. And in between that, we were just talking about non-Pathfinder things that were interesting to us. And then we've got, like I said, we've got about 10 bloggers. So we have a blog or two related to Pathfinder or Starfinder on our website, nodirectionpodcast.com, every day of the week, every weekday. Okay. And that includes Luis Loza he writes our monsters on Friday. And he started as one of our bloggers, and he works for Paizo now. He got hired as a developer, and he is one of the main people that is working on the campaign setting specific books that they're putting out. Wow. Yeah, and when he got hired, like it was about 6 months of, are you sure you can carry the load of being both full-time Paizo and blogger? And are we allowed? And like we kept asking Luis, he said, yes, this is totally fine with me. We kept asking Paizo, and they're like, yeah, hey, he was yours first. And that relationship is advanced to the point that now our actual play podcasts have Paizo staff on them. Yeah. So Adventurous, the one I talked about, War for the Crown, was developed by Crystal Fraser when she was working for Paizo. She's our GM. Oh, wow. And Jason Keeley, who works on the Starfinder team, is one of the players in the game. And then on the Starfinder side, we've got an actual play podcast called Beyond. Not Beyond, Stellar. And Amanda Hammond, who is one of the main designers on Starfinder, is a player in that game. And she's actually playing a class from a book that's not out until next month. She's been playing this thing for like 6 months. Huh.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's incredible. It's just amazing what podcasts and have really just opened up the world. And that the creative teams are right there playing, and everybody can watch that. That's just I don't know. It's just fascinating.
Well, everyone has something. Like, people want to talk. That's why social media became a thing. Like, at one point, this was something we were afraid of, and we thought that someone being able to read our minds was a superpower to be afraid of. But now we're like posting tweets begging people to read our minds. Yeah. And so the idea of someone coming to you and being like, here's a thing that you spent a lot of time working on. Would you like to just talk about it for 2 hours? They will like jump at the opportunity. And when you can make it a good, fun conversation, like apparently we have the skill to do, it can really take off.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. Now, you've also designed some games, right? And have you published under the OGL as well?
I have published a couple of things under the OGL, but mainly I have freelanced for other publishers. So I've done some work for third-party publishers, mainly Cobalt Press when they had Cobalt Quarterly, which was like a quarterly version of Dragon Magazine. So I had a couple of things come out there. One was Gnomish Flying Contraptions was the first published work I ever had. And it was just first edition Pathfinder or 3.5 Dungeons & Dragons? I think it was Pathfinder. And it was just ways that gnomes have tried to fly. And then that was followed up with, was the second thing I did the Savant? Yeah, at one point I made an extremely complicated class that went through the ringers. So originally it was supposed to be He-Man, the Incredible Hulk, like the character that is 90% of the time, the weak dweeb. But when combat strikes, he can replace himself with an entirely different entity that has all these mystical powers. That was the original pitch, and it was called the Coffer. And that kind of evolved into, no, we want more of a jack of all trades. And so it became the Raconteur, which was a storyteller. And as he's telling the stories, he embodies them. So if he's telling the story about the mystical warrior, then suddenly he grows a sword and grows magical powers that he didn't have before. And so when that was finally released, it became the Savant, which kind of has a reputation of the most complicated class that was ever published for Pathfinder, to the point that at one point, Cobalt Press made a compendium of all their classes, and I wasn't available to help them develop it for the book. And so it became the only class for a while that was not going to be in the book. And so I was like, no, I don't want that to be the legacy of the Savant. So I cleared up my schedule, met with the person that was developing it, and being like, here's one of the reasons this class is so complex, because it started at this, ended at this. So if this is the end point, then let's see how we would have got to that end point if that was also our beginning point. And so we reconceived the class from the ground up, knowing that we wanted to be the Savant, the person who understands things so much that he could become all kinds of different classes and swap out class features for more familiar class features, limited number of times per day. And we downplayed some of the Raconteur flavor that was still in there and kind of bogged the Savant down as like this genius who's also a storyteller, and it just became, this is the genius. He can mystically know and do everything. Outside of that, I did the Mosaic Mage for Rogue Genius Games, which was really cool. It was so one of the advantages of having the podcast is that I will talk to the publishers and be like, what kind of stuff do you look for? And so Owen Casey Stevens of Rogue Genius Games said, whenever there's a big pop culture thing coming out, we like to put a book that kind of ties into it. And so Green Lantern was coming out, and I was like, well, this is going to be huge and popular. So I made the Mosaic Mage, which was basically, what if Wizards did color? It was all color-based magic. And so here's the primary colors, and you could multi-class your primary colors into you can be part yellow, part blue, and be a green mage. And how does that change the flavor? What original things does that unlock based on that? And it was a super fun class to design, and there was a little serendipity where it was like, here's the different schools of magic, here's the number of different directions I need to go with these colors if I go primary and secondary. Wow, that's the exact same number. So that ends up perfectly saving me all kinds of time of forcing these things to work together. It was especially fun because I never play caster characters, and so I got to ask myself, what does a caster player look for in their class? How do I deliver on that? How do I also make this the kind of class I would want to play even as someone who doesn't deliver on casters? Who doesn't play casters? And these third-party credits. I'm missing a big one. I actually wrote a book by myself, like an 80,000-word book that was published by Four Winds Fantasy Game called Strategists and Tacticians, which was loaded with what Pathfinder eventually put out as archetypes. I had as alternate classes. So this was one of the main things that separated Pathfinder from 3.5 Dungeons & Dragons. And I stumbled on a similar concept early on. And so that got me some writing jobs with Paizo on Ultimate Campaign, where I wrote the Animal Companion rules. And what else have I worked on? I worked on Giants Revisited. So the Revisited line was a really cool series of books that Paizo did, where they would take classic monsters that we know about and usually got a page or two in the bestiary or the monster manual, and say, what if we give them a chapter and just really flesh them out? And their first book was Classic Monsters Revisited, and it was a huge success. And how they redefined goblins helped define Pathfinder and separate it from Dungeons & Dragons further, because it was like, goblins are fun again. Goblins have been cannon fodder for so long that they've lost all interesting aspects to them. So now what if they all go into battle singing these weird songs about killing you, and they are afraid of dogs and horses, and they love pickles, and all kinds of little details that just made them super interesting. Oh, and you can't read the written words because otherwise it'll steal those words from your brain. And so if a goblin's ever caught with a book, you've got to kill that goblin right away before it spreads. So those Revisited books became a series, and I worked on Giants Revisited, where I wrote the Hill Giant. And one of my main goals was to separate the Hill Giant from the Ogre, because they've both kind of got similar origins. And Paizo had taken the Ogre and turned it into like, oh, these are like weird, inbred, very super cruel monsters. So I was like, okay, so just don't go that direction with the Hill Giant. I'm going to make them over consumers. It's not necessarily that they're evil, but they will walk into a land and they will just eat everything, claim everything far beyond what they actually need. That makes them clearly evil, but clearly different from the ogres. And for whatever reason in development, they replaced that with Hill Giants are just naturally cruel monsters who will hunt you down and kill you. And it's like, well, now they're just ogres again.
Oh, no.
But for a while, I had to take a break from freelancing because we ran a Kickstarter for our game, and one of the not a Kickstarter for our game, ran a Kickstarter for the website because I've had a couple of catastrophic computer failures in the time we were running the podcast. So to help fund them, we did a Kickstarter where it's like fund the next season of No Direction, which was basically help Ryan buy a computer that's actually equipped for podcasting, for audio and video editing, instead of just the computer he would buy as a freelance writer that he always kind of saw himself as before the podcast became, the bigger thing that I do with my time. One of the stretch goals was an adventure called Millie Narstead is Missing. So early on in No Direction, we had a segment which was supposed to be like a travel show where Millie Narstead, the gnome on the go, would go to a different location and just give you the highlights, like a travel book. And it was just one of the most unpopular things we ever did, to the point that it like got notorious, and people would make jokes about Millie Narstead years after we dropped the segment. And so like she had a bit of a cult following. Some people liked the concept but hated the execution. So it's like, all right, so Millie Narstead has gone missing. What actually happened to her? So we wrote that adventure, and then I unfortunately got just the worst case of writer's block I've ever had, and I delayed that book for years, literally. Wow. And I was refusing to take any other freelance work or any other writing work other than what I was doing at Blind Ferret, which we can talk about, or I can summarize a little later, which was my day job. So I basically fell off freelancing for Pathfinder because I had this albatross around my neck that finally I hired a couple of other writers to help me with, and like threw money at it, threw my own personal money to help us get through this. Just buckled down, wrote several nights in a row, forcing myself to write something, editing what I wrote. And at one point I was just like buried in partially written drafts. So I hired Mike Myler as the project manager, and he looked it over and he's like, okay, the good news is you've probably got more stuff here than you realize, and you are closer to being done than you realize, but it's a disorganized mess. So before you write anything else, let's put things in order, figure out what is where as far as what needs to be done. And so we started just banging it out, started just working a little more logically, systematically, and finally got the book out, sent it to backers. I even posted it to DriveThru RPG, but I never really promoted that you can go out and buy it, because it was, as happy as I was that it was done, and as proud as I am with the final product, I'm still just kind of embarrassed with how the whole ordeal went down. And I've gotten out of the idea that I would do any self-publishing after that. I would do freelance work for someone else, as long as somebody else is managing me and is setting certain deadlines and certain things, because otherwise it just seems like I get overwhelmed with my own brain. So finally I'm back to doing some freelance stuff, and I managed to get a writing assignment for an upcoming Pathfinder book that hasn't been announced yet, but it's satisfying to be back in the freelance game and to kind of have whatever stigma was on me as a freelancer based on Millie Narstead is Missing, just kind of finally going into the ether.
Okay. So yeah, apparently your self-publishing experience wasn't great. But what do you think about people, just anybody, being able to publish either a game or an adventure or a campaign nowadays?
Oh, that's amazing. And it's like, especially because so many people do the full prep, they write out the full adventure. And if it's a hit with your players, that's effectively your hobby has turned into playtesting, which is one of the most essential steps of actually publishing stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So the OGL and with PDF products becoming so prevalent,
Mm-hmm.
which is not something that the OGL had in mind when it was written.
Yeah.
But now with DriveThruRPG and other websites selling PDFs, it's super easy for you to just write a product, put it out there, and it'll often be a product that you had written anyway. So it takes very little extra work to go to the next step.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you happen to make money, great. If you want to put money into the promotion and money and time, you can do that too. And it very quickly can become a nice side career that if you play the cards right, will never stop being a hobby.
Yes. And I know I often let people know, even though I say don't prep for a session, if you are prepping, you should publish it. If you're spending time on creating something like that, you should just publish it, because you can just make it a PDF and put it right on DriveThruRPG. And of course, self-publishing on DriveThruRPG was kind of the beginning to my whole kind of journey with Dice Geeks. And, now I do that full time. So, I mean, it's just amazing. But you mentioned Blind Ferret really quickly. Is that maybe just really quickly before we wrap up? What was that?
Oh boy, really quickly on Blind Ferret. So Blind Ferret is the publisher of Looking for Group and Least I Can Do, which are webcomics that have been around for 10, 15 years each. And both of them are very popular webcomics. Looking for Group, at one point, we have a video of our main character, Richard. Not our main character, our most popular character, who's an undead warlock who's like exceptionally cruel and really funny about it. Has a very Deadpool quality to him. Mm-hmm. We have a music video called Slaughter Your World. And when it released, it was the highest ranked video on YouTube in the comedy category. Mm-hmm. And so we've been doing those for years. I don't write the comics, but I was brought into the company first just to kind of do like copy editing and copywriting. And then eventually I was developing products for them. And actually I first came to the company's attention when I pitched them the idea of doing a Looking for Group box set for Pathfinder, which I wrote, I sent over to them, they paid me. And then they didn't have anyone on staff that was equipped to develop this product. So even though they had bought it, it just sat there. And so eventually I let them know I was looking to change careers, that I wasn't happy with my current job. So if they had any position open there, so they brought me in to do just menial tasks. And eventually they hired a new artist, and they really needed to give her, like, to get her practice drawing our characters. And it just came together. That's like, all right, so instead of reusing art from the comic, like I figured we would do for the project, they told me to just give her like 100 assignments of original art to do for this box set. So she and I worked together, and then they were just like, all right, well, you wrote the thing, you're doing the art direction for the thing, just become the project manager on it. And so then they were paying me to develop the product that I had pitched them. They had paid me as a freelancer for, which is exceptionally rare and really not the best way to do things. But at least, unlike with Milling Arstead, I was on the ball with this. This was a work assignment, and I had the support that I needed to do this properly and to fulfill it. So one of my first and major releases with Blind Ferret is this RPG box set that we sold out of not too long ago, that takes the Pathfinder role-playing game and turns it into a lighter, more comedic, but still like high fantasy adventure thing. So it really matches the tone of the Looking for Group comic, but it's all compatible with the first edition of the Pathfinder role-playing game. So it was a multifunctional product that we could sell to different people for different reasons. It was a nice novelty item if you were just a fan of Looking for Group. It was a useful product if you were a fan of Pathfinder. And it was an introductory role-playing game if you had never played role-playing games before, but for whatever reason were attracted to this product. It had dice, it had maps, it had an adventure in there, it had all the rules to make characters from level 1 to 10. From there, because that was so successful, I got a job as the project developer. And in that time, I developed and released an action figure based on Richard. I've developed t-shirts, socks, What other zany thing have I released? We've got a board game called Orphans and Ashes, which I'm the designer of. I'm the developer on. I'm the one who contacted China, got the manufacturer, got every step of the way done, because this is actually a pretty a very tactile game. So you're playing as either Kale, who is our actual good guy, and the main character of our comic running into an orphanage trying to save orphans. And so it's a miniature where Kale's kind of looks like he's just in a strongman pose where he's flexing his muscles up over his head. Mm-hmm. But if you take the orphan miniatures, which just look like they're running around with their hands over their heads, screaming in panic, they're actually, their fingers joined together, their thumbs do, creating a loop that lets you hook them onto Kale's arms. And so you are actually supposed to go in, pick up the orphans, put them on the Kale miniature, and walk them around the orphanage and try and carry them to safety, which was very like a component. Like there was no room for error in how these components had to work together. So I was working with a 3D artist. I was working with the manufacturers in China. It was like just every aspect of this game I had to develop and watch very closely while making sure it's a fun game, balanced rules. Everything makes sense about it. And that's also been one of our most successful products. I've developed miniatures, metal miniatures based on the Looking for Group cast. Just looking around, I'm sure there are some other things in my house, maybe even with arm's reach, that I've developed, but I can't think of them right now. But if you go to lfgcomic.co, I believe is our current website, okay, which I really should know that offhand. Yeah, lfg.co, and you should click on the store. If you look at the stuff from the last 2 or 3 years, most of it is products that I developed or designed.
Well, Ryan, it was a pleasure having you on the show. I will make sure that I will link up your podcast as well as a number of your games in the show notes for this episode. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, guys, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Ryan. If you want to learn more about his podcast and his RPG projects, I have provided links to all of those in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. If you want free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free and you will receive 10 dungeon maps and some other RPG resources that you can use in your campaigns. Plus, you will never miss an episode of this podcast. Also, if you would like me to continue making these episodes, please head over to Patreon/DiceGeeks and consider supporting the show. Any support on Patreon is just like a vote of confidence for me that I know that people want me to continue making this show. So I thank you for listening, and until next time, keep gaming.